Today we're going to examine how several major empires responded to Western expansion and imperialism during the 19th century. So during this time, European powers were expanding their influence across the globe. Even countries that avoided direct colonization still had to deal with military pressure, economic competition, and cultural influence from the West. Keep in mind, it's not just European powers, it's also US powers are doing it at this time too. And we'll talk a little bit about US influence and their imperialism. But three major empires faced this challenge in different ways. And that's going to be China, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan. So let's start with China. At the beginning of the 19th century, you have to keep in mind China was still one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. However, they do have some internal problems that were beginning to weaken them. China's population had grown dramatically, and by the mid 1800s, that population had reached over 400 million people. And this created a lot of pressure on farmland and just internal resources. At the same time, you're going to read about the corruption within the government and how that corruption made it difficult for the state to respond to these problems. And one of the most dramatic events is this rebellion that happens. The leader of this rebellion, Hong Xiaochuan, he believed he was the younger brother of Jesus and claimed he had been chosen to create a new heavenly kingdom. And so the Taiping movement called for radical reforms, including equality between men and women and equal distribution of land, which now that doesn't seem very radical, the equality between men and women, but you have to remember this is like a patriarchal society. The distribution of land equally among its people, that is a little radical, especially for US mindset. That seems a little like socialist or communist for us. But that was what this rebellion was calling for. It's going to fail. It caused enormous destruction, and between 20 and 30 million people die. And this is a engraving of that leader. I'm sorry I didn't scroll down before. So China also faced pressure from European powers. One of the most important conflicts is known as the Opium War. And British merchants began selling large amounts of opium to China, and this created widespread addiction. And when Chinese officials tried to stop the trade, Britain responded with military force. So, and during this time, keep in mind, a lot of Chinese people are going to leave. The Opium Wars is like a push factor. So a lot of people are being pushed out of China and they're going to be pulled into the United States. If you think about it, China isn't, it kind of makes sense for them to come from China directly to the shores of like California. So that's why we have a lot of Chinese immigrants. You've got like Chinatown and, certain parts of California are large cities. There's usually like a Chinese population, Chinese neighborhood known as Chinatown. And that's because they're being pushed out of China and pulled to the United States. Because remember, a few decades before, well, actually during this time period, right after they're being pushed and pulled into the United States, gold is going to be found in California. So a lot of people that are displaced during the Opium Wars, they're going to come in huge droves into the west coast of the United States. But back to Chinese and China mainland, what we see is that after losing the war, they are forced to sign this treaty. And the treaty, it opened Chinese ports to foreign trade, but it weakened their sovereignty. Like they don't really have a lot of control anymore over their own affairs, right? So let's kind of look at the Ottoman Empire, the empire full of furniture. And let's see what was happening in the Ottoman Empire. So during the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, they're gradually going to lose their territory. And you can kind of tell by this map here. And this map is also located in the textbook for you. And not only are they losing their territory, but they're also losing their influence. And because of that weakening of their power, the Europeans often called it the sick man of Europe. Ottoman leaders, They attempted reforms, and these reforms included modern schools, new legal systems, and administrative changes. And there's those reforms for you. However, it also created a lot of tensions between modernizers and those who wanted to preserve those traditional Islamic institutions throughout the Ottoman Empire. And you do have the rise of the Young Turks, and you're going to read about the Young Turks and their influence on the Ottoman Empire and Turkish nationalism. But our final outcome is the Ottoman Empire will eventually collapse after World War I. So now let's look at Japan. This is a depiction of American ships by Japanese artists. They were known as the Black Ships of America, or the Black Ships of the United States. So this was not like a welcome sight. This is a morbid depiction kind of predicting or this foreshadowing of what is to come. So Japan's encounter with the Western powers, it began when this guy, Commodore Matthew Perry, arrived in 1853 and demanded that Japan open its ports to foreign trade. And this event is going to trigger a political revolution known as the Meiji Restoration. It happens in 1868, and Japanese leaders decided that the best way to protect their country was to just modernize as quickly as they could. So they abolished the old feudal system, they created a national army, they built railroads and factories, and they invested very heavily in education. And within a few decades, what we see is Japan has transformed itself into a powerful industrial nation, and they soon defeated China and Russia in war and began building its own empire in the East. And there is some unrest that the Japanese empire, it creates, like they are going to invade mainland Asia and try to take over parts of China and try to take over parts of Russia. And they do this with some limited success, and we'll get to that later on as we get closer to like World War I and World War II. But when we compare these three empires, when we compare Japan, the Ottoman Empire, and China, we see very different outcomes with these three. And you're going to read more about those outcomes, but you're going to see China and the Ottoman Empire, they really struggled to adapt to Western pressure, while Japan just like went all in. They rapidly modernized, they become a global power. But historians remind us that ideas of success and failure are very complicated. Modernization, it brought power to some countries, but it also created new social problems and hardships for many people. And keep in mind, history is shaped by complex choices made under difficult circumstances, often without knowing what the future will hold, right? Hindsight's 2020. If we look back, we can see clear answers, but at this time, they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know that there is a global conflict in the very near future, and they are almost knocking on its door during this time period of what we're talking about. So as you go through, kind of look at those the differences between China, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire and how they react to this invasion, and having to decide, are we going to modernize by Western standards of modernization, or are we going to keep the path that we have and stay on course?